Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the lava lake murders. The year was 1923, and the place was the high desert of Oregon, a land where the horizon is jagged with the peaks of the Cascade Mountains, and the air is scented with the sharp, clean fragrance of ancient ponderosa pines. Imagine a landscape blanketed in a heavy, muffled silence. It is a world where the snow falls not in flakes, but in thick, heavy curtains that drape over the world until every sound is swallowed by the white. In the winter of 1923, 3 men sought their fortune in this beautiful, brutal isolation. They were fur trappers, men who knew the language of the forest and the rhythm of the seasons. There was Edward Nichols, who had reached his 50th year with the steady hands and keen eyes of a veteran outdoorsman. Beside him stood Roy Wilson, a 35-year-old former Marine whose strength was as solid as the timber they used for their fires. And finally, there was the youngest of the group, Dewey Morris, who was just 25 years old, full of the quiet energy of a man looking to prove himself in the wild. Together, they made their home in a sturdy log cabin near the edge of Little Lava Lake, a remote sanctuary owned by a logging contractor named Edward Logan. The cabin was a small island of warmth in a sea of ice, its chimney breathing soft, gray smoke into the indigo sky of the Oregon wilderness. The winter of 1923 into 1924 was particularly harsh, the kind of season that locks the world in a frozen grip for months on end. For these 3 men, the isolation was not a burden, but a business. They spent their days trekking through the knee-deep powder, checking their lines for marten and fox, their breath blooming in white clouds before them. Edward Nichols was known to be in high spirits that year. Just a week before Christmas, he had made the long journey into the town of Bend, leading a sled piled high with the finest furs they had gathered. The townspeople remembered him as jovial, his face weathered by the wind, but glowing with the satisfaction of a successful season. He told everyone who would listen that the trapping was better than it had been in years, and that their little group was faring well in the deep woods. He spoke of the warmth of the cabin, the steady supply of wood they had chopped, and the companionship that kept the winter blues at bay. When he turned back toward the mountains, leaving the flickering lights of Bend behind, no one could have known that it was the last time the valley would see his face in the light of day. He disappeared back into the white vastness, returning to the cabin where Roy and Dewey waited, tucked away beneath the shadow of Mount Bachelor. The month of January brought even deeper snows, and a silence that seemed to grow heavier with every passing night. On the 15th of January, 1924, a friend named Alan Wilcoxon made his way through the forest on snowshoes. He was traveling from his home in Fall River toward his own resort at Elk Lake, a trek of nearly 30 miles through the wilderness. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, violet shadows across the drifts, he saw the familiar shape of the Logan cabin. He was welcomed inside with the genuine warmth that only exists between people who understand the solitude of the high desert. That evening was spent in the golden glow of oil lamps and the crackling heat of the wood stove. Alan would later recall that the 3 men were in excellent spirits. They shared a meal, talked of the season's success, and enjoyed the simple comfort of human company. The walls of the cabin, thick and honest, seemed to protect them from the biting wind that howled outside. As the fire burned down to glowing embers, they rested, unaware that the passage of time was already beginning to slip away from them. On the morning of January 16th, Alan Wilcoxon strapped on his snowshoes once more and waved goodbye, his tracks slowly filling with fresh snow as he disappeared into the timber. He was the last person to ever see Edward, Roy, and Dewey alive. Weeks passed, and the silence from the Little Lava Lake cabin grew profound. In the town of Bend, families began to wonder why the men had not returned for supplies or sent word of their progress. The high desert has a way of hiding things, of keeping secrets beneath the ice, but the first sign that something had gone terribly wrong did not come from a human voice. It came from the men's loyal companion, a dog named Tote. In late January, the animal was discovered wandering alone, miles from the cabin. The dog was a ghost of its former self, its ribs pushing sharply against its matted fur, its eyes clouded with a frantic, hollow hunger. It was found shivering in the snow, a creature that had clearly survived on nothing but instinct and desperation for a very long time. When the dog was brought to safety, its condition sent a ripple of unease through the community. A trapper does not leave his dog to starve. A trapper does not allow his animals to wander into the freezing night while he sits by a warm fire. The sight of the emaciated animal was a silent alarm, a signal that the order of the cabin had been shattered. The silence of the high desert, once peaceful and serene, suddenly took on a much darker quality. It was no longer the silence of a sleeping forest. It was the silence of an empty house where the doors have been left swinging in the wind. As the news of the starving dog spread, the sense of dread deepened. Friends and family members began to gather, whispering about the possibilities. Perhaps they had been caught in an avalanche, or perhaps the winter illness that often plagued remote camps had taken them. But there was a nagging feeling in the air, a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. The Deschutes National Forest is vast, and searching it in the heart of winter was a task few were willing to undertake without cause. Yet the image of the dog remained in their minds, a living testament to a missing master. The cabin at Little Lava Lake stood alone, miles from the nearest soul, wrapped in the white shroud of the Oregon Cascades. Inside, the clocks may have still been ticking, or perhaps they had already wound down, leaving the rooms to be claimed by the frost. The traps in the woods were now surely buried, the animals they had caught long since frozen into statues of ice. The mystery had begun, not with a scream or a shot, but with the quiet, desperate whimpering of a dog that had lost its way home. We are left to wonder what the dog saw in those final moments, and what shadows moved across the snow while the world believed the three trappers were safe in their beds. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well. The winter of 1924 did not surrender easily to the coming spring. In the high altitudes of the Cascade Mountains, the snow clung to the jagged peaks like a heavy, suffocating shroud, muffling the world in a crystalline silence. As February bled into March, the air remained sharp and biting, a cold that settled deep within the marrow of the bone. But eventually, the sun began to linger just a few minutes longer each evening, casting long, violet shadows across the frozen surface of Little Lava Lake. The once solid ice began to groan and creak under the weight of its own shifting mass, a low, rhythmic sound that echoed through the empty pines like the steady heartbeat of a waking giant. Tiny rivulets of water started to trickle from the eaves of the trapper's cabin, dripping with a persistent, hypnotic rhythm onto the hardened drifts below. The smell of the wilderness began to change, shifting from the sterile, scentless chill of midwinter to the heavy, damp aroma of wet pine needles and thawing earth. It was a season of transition, a time when the mountain usually hummed with the promise of new life. But that year, the atmosphere was thick with a lingering, unshakable dread that seemed to seep out from the very timber of the cabin walls. In mid-April, when the snow had finally retreated enough to allow for a difficult passage, a small group of men moved through the slushy terrain with heavy hearts and growing suspicion. Pearl Linz and Innis Owen Morris led the way, their snowshoes sinking into the soft, treacherous crust of the remaining drifts. When they finally reached the log cabin, the silence that greeted them was absolute, broken only by the frantic escape of a starving, emaciated cat that bolted through the door the moment it was pushed open. Inside, the scene was a grotesque tableau of a life interrupted. On the table, plates had been set for a meal that was never eaten. In the pots on the cold stove, the remnants of food had long since turned into blackened, unrecognizable husks, scorched and abandoned in a moment of sudden, violent transition. The calendar on the wall remained pinned to the month of January, its pages yellowing in the damp mountain air. There was a profound sense of wrongness in the stillness. The men's heavy winter coats still hung on their pegs, and their rifles, the essential tools of their survival, remained untouched in the gun racks. It was as if Edward Nichols, Roy Wilson, and Dewey Morris had simply evaporated into the thin mountain mist, leaving their entire world behind to rot in the encroaching warmth. As the search party expanded their circle, the clues became increasingly grim. Outside the cabin, the pens that should have housed the valuable foxes were empty, the gates swinging aimlessly in the wind with a rusted, rhythmic whine. In the corner of one pen, half buried in the melting slush, they discovered a heavy claw hammer. Its metal head was stained with a dark, rusted hue that the men knew instinctively was not from the weather. Nearby, they found the remains of the foxes themselves, their carcasses discarded with a chilling lack of care. Some had been skinned with the precision of a master trapper, while others had been butchered with a clumsy, frantic hand, suggesting that two different people, one skilled and one amateur, had been at work in the shadows of the cabin. The searchers followed a faint, disturbing trail away from the dwelling, where the snow was no longer pure and white. Instead, it was marred by dark, frozen patches. As they brushed away the top layer of slush, they found more than just stains. They found clumps of human hair and a single human tooth, a small, ivory fragment of a life that had been violently extinguished. The trail of blood led them toward the shoreline of Big Lava Lake, marking a path of struggle and silence that ended at the water's edge. At the lake's edge, they discovered the trapper's large transport sled, abandoned and heavily stained with the same dark, ominous residue. It sat lopsided on the slushy bank, its wooden runners biting into the mud. From the shore, a series of faint indentations stretched out onto the gray, honeycomb ice of the lake, leading toward a peculiar depression about 100 yards out. Even from a distance, it was clear that a large hole had been chopped into the ice weeks or months before, only to be sealed over by a thin, translucent layer of new frost as the temperatures plummeted again in January. The searchers stood on the shore, the cold wind whipping across the open water, staring at that unnatural scar in the ice. They knew the lake was deep and frigid, a tomb of liquid stone that held its secrets with a relentless grip. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting a pale, sickly light over the water, the realization set in that the spring thaw would not bring renewal this year. It would only bring a horrific clarity. They returned to the cabin to wait for the authorities, the silence of the woods now feeling heavy and watchful, as if the mountain itself was waiting for the ice to finally give up what had been hidden beneath its surface. On the afternoon of April 23rd, the high mountain sun finally gained enough strength to break the lake's winter seal. The ice, which had been gray and rotting for days, suddenly fractured and dissolved into the dark, churning water. As the surface cleared, the depths surrendered their burden. Floating a few hundred feet from the shore, the bodies of 3 men rose slowly to the light, buoyed by the gases of decomposition and the shifting currents of the thaw. Sheriff Clarence Adams and his deputies arrived to find a scene that would haunt the local community for decades. Even though the day was clear and the air was fresh with the scent of spring, the sheriff later noted that the atmosphere around the lake was impregnated with the unmistakable, heavy odor of death. Using a small boat, the searchers rowed out into the center of the lake, the oars cutting through the mirrored surface with a soft, splashing sound. One by one, the remains were retrieved from the frigid water. The process was slow and somber, a grim harvest performed in the shadow of Mount Bachelor. The water was so cold it had preserved the men's features in a haunting, waxen mask, allowing the searchers to recognize their friends even through the ravages of the months they had spent submerged in the dark. The condition of the bodies told a story of unimaginable cruelty. Edward Nichols was found still wearing his glasses, his face frozen in a look of eternal surprise, though his jaw had been completely shattered by the impact of a close-range shotgun blast. Roy Wilson, the former Marine, had been struck by both a shotgun and a pistol. A bullet lodged just behind his ear. Dewey Morris, the youngest of the three at only 25 years old, had suffered a horrific blunt force injury to his skull, likely from the very hammer found in the fox pen, and his arm bore the mark of a defensive gunshot wound. It was clear that they had been lured out or ambushed, their bodies wrapped in canvas and weighted down before being pushed through the hole in the ice. As the sun set on the 24th of April, the sleds that were once used to haul precious furs were now loaded with the heavy, sodden remains of the men themselves. The journey back to the town of Bend was a slow, funeral procession through the melting wilderness. Behind them, the lake was still once more, its surface reflecting the stars, but the peace of the Cascades had been shattered forever. The ice had melted, and the truth had surfaced. But the question of who could commit such a calculated, heartless act remained locked away in the shadows of the forest. The air inside the log cabin at Little Lava Lake did not carry the scent of life, but rather the heavy, cloying weight of a story left unfinished. When the search party pushed through the heavy wooden door in April of 1924, the silence that greeted them was absolute, a thick blanket of frozen time that seemed to muffle their very heartbeats. The interior of the small structure, crafted from sturdy timber and meant to be a sanctuary against the brutal Oregon winter, had become a tomb for the men's memories. Light filtered through the small, frost-rimmed windows in pale, dusty shafts, illuminating a scene that was as mundane as it was terrifying. On the heavy timber table, 3 plates sat waiting. They were positioned with the care of men who valued routine and order in the middle of the wilderness. To see them there, clean and expectant, was to feel the sudden, jarring absence of the hands that should have been reaching for forks and knives. Beside the plates, the pots on the cold cook stove held the charred, blackened remains of a meal that had long since surrendered its moisture to the heat, and then to the months of bitter cold. It was a breakfast interrupted, a moment in time where the simple act of nourishment was shattered by an intrusion so sudden that the men had not even reached for their coats or their rifles, which still hung in their racks like skeletal remains of a life once lived. As the searchers moved deeper into the cramped living space, the sensory details of the abandonment became more pointed. A wall calendar hung near the doorway, its pages still open to January, the month when the world last heard the voices of Edward Nichols, Roy Wilson, and Dewey Morris. The paper was slightly curled from the dampness, a silent witness to the passage of weeks that no one inside the cabin would ever count. Magazines and old newspapers were scattered across the floor, not in the way of a peaceful evening of reading, but with the chaotic energy of a room that had been rifled through by hands looking for something more valuable than words. The skinning racks, usually draped with the pride of a season's hard work, stood naked and neglected. The wood of the racks was dry and splintered, missing the suppleness of fresh pelts. Outside, the world was a vast, white expanse, but inside, the mess spoke of a desperate search. The beds were unmade, the blankets tossed aside as if the occupants had been lured out or dragged away in the middle of a thought. There was no sign of a struggle within these 4 walls, no overturned chairs or shattered glass, which only deepened the mystery. It suggested that the violence had begun elsewhere, or that the men had been let out by a voice they trusted, leaving behind the warmth of the hearth for the biting chill of the pines. The focus shifted then to the records of their labor, what many came to call the trapper's log of their final days. While no formal diary was found, the state of the trap lines provided a tragic chronicle of their demise. When the investigators ventured out into the surrounding woods, they found a grim museum of the men's industry. 12 marten, 4 foxes, and a single skunk remained trapped in the rusted steel jaws of the lines the men had set with such care. These animals were now nothing but frozen husks, their fur ruined by the elements and the passage of months. To a trapper, Leaving a line unattended is a sin of the highest order, a sign of total incapacitation or death. Each frozen creature was a marker on a timeline, proving that the work had stopped abruptly in mid-January. The meticulous nature of Edward Nichols, the eldest of the three, was well known in Bend. He would never have allowed such a waste of life or profit. The discovery of these untended lines was the first definitive proof that the men had not simply moved on to another camp or decided to leave the forest early. They were still here, or at least, the evidence of their sudden disappearance was written in the snow and the steel of the forest floor. The most harrowing evidence, however, lay just behind the cabin in the fox pen. This enclosure had once held 5 valuable silver foxes, animals owned by Edward Logan and entrusted to the 3 trappers in exchange for their winter lodging. These foxes were the crown jewels of the trapping season, each pelt worth a small fortune in the markets of Portland or San Francisco. But the pen was now empty, the wire mesh swaying slightly in the mountain breeze. In the corner of the enclosure, half buried in the melting spring slush, the searchers found a claw hammer. Its metal head was stained with a dark, rusted hue that was unmistakable. Adhered to the dried blood were several strands of human hair, and most chillingly, a single human tooth. It was a brutal, primitive weapon left behind in the snow, a stark contrast to the sophisticated firearms the men kept inside. The presence of the hammer in the fox pen suggested a struggle of terrible intimacy, a confrontation where the killer had used whatever was at hand to silence his victims. The silver foxes were gone, and the heavy tote sleds used to haul supplies and furs were also missing from their usual spots against the cabin wall. The motive was becoming as clear as the mountain air: greed. The value of the missing furs was estimated to be over $1,500, a staggering sum in 1924, enough to drive a desperate man to slaughter. Following the trail from the cabin toward the lake, the investigators found more echoes of the violence. In an unthawed patch of snow, they discovered pools of deep crimson that had been preserved by the ice, looking as fresh as if they had been spilled only hours before. More hair and fragments of bone were scattered along the path leading to the shore of Big Lava Lake, a quarter of a mile away. It was here that they found one of the missing sleds, abandoned near the water's edge. The wood of the sled was marked with dark, vertical stains where blood had seeped into the grain. The story the sled told was one of heavy burdens being moved across the frozen landscape toward the center of the lake. Near the boat launch, the ice showed signs of having been tampered with. A large hole, roughly 3 feet across, had been chopped into the thick winter crust and then allowed to refreeze, leaving a jagged, opaque scar on the surface of the water. The search party stood on that ice, the wind whipping around them, realizing that the cabin was just the stage and the lake was the final resting place. The meticulous life of the trappers, recorded in their set tables and their neatly kept lines, had been erased by a predator who valued silver fox pelts more than human life. As the sun began to dip behind the Cascades, casting long, violet shadows across the snow, the investigators knew they were no longer looking for missing men. They were looking for the dead. The discovery at the lake's edge had chilled the air more than the winter wind ever could. As the investigators stood over the bloodied snow, the silence of the Deschutes National Forest felt heavy, almost suffocating. But beneath that silence, a name began to circulate among the search party, a name that carried a weight of its own: Charles Kimsey. It was not a new name to the local authorities in Bend, nor was it one that inspired anything but a deep, crawling sense of unease. For the sheriff, the pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a jagged, terrifying picture. The focus shifted away from the desolate, ice-locked cabin and toward the dark history of a man who had walked those same woods just months before. Kimsey was not merely a drifter. He was a shadow that had been looming over Edward Nichols for quite some time. To understand why he became the primary suspect, One must look back to the previous summer, to a time when the sun still warmed the pine needles and the mountain air was sweet with the scent of high-altitude summer. It was during those months that a poisonous seed was planted, a conflict that would eventually lead to the frozen horror the searchers now faced. In the late summer of 1923, Edward Nichols had taken on a partner for his trapping ventures. At the time, the man went by the alias Lee Collins. He was a capable woodsman, strong and quiet, but there was a hidden sharpness in his eyes that made those around him tread carefully. The partnership was short-lived and ended in a bitter public explosion of tempers. Nichols had discovered that $500 was missing, a staggering sum for a trapper in those days, and he was certain that Collins was the thief. The accusation was not just a whisper, it was a formal report to the law. When the authorities looked into this Lee Collins, they found a man woven out of lies. His real name was Charles Kimsey, and he was a fugitive who had escaped from the Idaho State Penitentiary years earlier. He had been serving time for burglary, a man who lived by taking what wasn't his. Before he vanished into the dense timber to avoid arrest, Kimsey made a chilling promise to Edward Nichols. He swore that he would return, and when he did, he would kill the man who had dared to turn him in. This wasn't a hollow threat made in the heat of an argument. It was a cold, calculated vow of vengeance that had haunted Nichols throughout the autumn months. The brutality of Kimsey's character was already well documented. In the year leading up to the murders, he had shown a capacity for violence that bordered on the sadistic. He had once hired a stagecoach driver named Harrison to take him toward the Idaho border. In the middle of a desolate stretch of road, Kimsey had attacked the man, binding him tightly with baling wire and forcing him to swallow a dose of poison. Believing the man would die in agony, Kimsey threw him down an abandoned, deep well and drove away in the stolen vehicle. By some miracle, the driver survived, managed to crawl out of the darkness, and reached a ranch known as Last Chance. This was the man the sheriff was now hunting, a man who treated human life as nothing more than an obstacle. As the investigation deepened in April of 1924, witnesses began to come forward with sightings from the crucial days in January. A traffic officer in Portland, a man named Bender, remembered an encounter on the 22nd of January. He recalled two men walking through the city streets, looking out of place in their rugged mountain clothes. One of them was carrying a heavy, bulging gunnysack over his shoulder, the coarse, fabric-stained and smelling of the wild. The man with the gunnysack had approached Officer Bender, asking for the location of a reputable fur dealer. The officer noticed something peculiar about the man's gait, a subtle limp, or a specific way of carrying himself that stayed in the policeman's mind. He directed them to the Schumacher Fur Company on 3rd Street. Later, when the owner of the fur company was questioned, he confirmed the story. A man had come in and sold a large collection of high-quality furs, including the pelts of silver foxes and martens. The seller had received $110 in cash. But the most damning detail was the piece of paper the man handed over to verify his identity. It was a trapping license. The name printed on that license was not Charles Kimsey. It was Edward Nichols. The very license belonging to the man whose body was currently lying beneath the ice of Little Lava Lake was being used by a stranger in Portland just days after the trappers had disappeared. The implication was sickening. The killer hadn't just taken their lives, he had taken their livelihoods, their identities, and the very furs they had spent the winter laboring to collect. Despite these leads, the shadow of Charles Kimsey remained elusive. The reward for his capture was set at $1,500, a massive sum that sent bounty hunters and lawmen scouring the Pacific Northwest. Yet, as the months turned into years, the trail grew cold. Kimsey seemed to have melted into the vastness of the American West, leaving the families of Nichols, Wilson, and Morris in a state of perpetual grief and unanswered questions. It wouldn't be until 1933, nearly a decade after the crime, that a man matching Kimsey's description would be spotted in Kalispell, Montana. By then, the memories of witnesses had faded, and the physical evidence at the cabin had been weathered by 10 winters. The man they brought back to Oregon was older, balder, and more cautious. He denied ever stepping foot near Lava Lake that winter, claiming he had been working in a railroad tunnel in Colorado. The investigation had hit a wall of time and distance, leaving the sheriff to wonder if the vengeful ghost of the summer of 1923 would ever truly be held to account for the 3 souls lost in the snow. The seasons in the high Cascades do not pass with a gentle hand. They scrape and grind against the landscape, burying secrets under layers of ice that take months to weep away. For nearly a decade, the silence surrounding Little Lava Lake was as thick and impenetrable as the winter crust. The world moved on. The roaring 20s gave way to the desperate, dusty hunger of the Great Depression, and the names of Edward Nichols, Roy Wilson, and Dewey Morris began to fade from the front pages of the Bend Bulletin. But for Sheriff Claude McCauley, the case was a living thing, a ghost that shared his office and walked beside him through the streets. He had traveled more than 10,000 miles in pursuit of a shadow, following whispers that led from the jagged peaks of Oregon to the wind-whipped plains of Idaho and the high mountain passes of Montana. Every time a drifter with a herky-jerky gait was spotted in a rail yard, or a man with a hissing, toothy smile was seen in a bunkhouse, the hope would flare up like a dying ember. But the shadow of Charles Kimsey remained just out of reach, a phantom drifting through a country that was increasingly filled with men who wanted to be forgotten. The years stretched into a long, gray ribbon of time. In the forests, the log cabin where the trappers had spent their final, jovial Christmas began to succumb to the elements. The wood groaned and silvered under the relentless sun, and the fox pens, once the site of such meticulous care and eventual brutality, were reclaimed by the creeping vines and the heavy snows. In the minds of the townspeople, the $1,500 reward became a relic of a different era, a ghost of a fortune that no one expected to collect. Yet, the investigation never truly ceased. McCauley kept the files close, the black-and-white photographs of the 3 men staring back at him with a frozen, youthful vitality. He studied the details of the crime scene until they were etched into his own memory. The smell of death that had impregnated the clear mountain air, the blood-stained hammer, and the single human tooth found in the melting snow. He knew that the man he was looking for was not just a common thief, but a figure of singular, calculated violence who had vanished into the vast, anonymous tapestry of the American West. In the spring of 1933, the shadow finally solidified into a man of flesh and bone. In the town of Kalispell, Montana, where the air is sharp and the mountains stand like sentinels over the valley, a former jailer was walking down a bustling street when his eyes fell upon a familiar face. It was a face that had aged, weathered by 10 years of life on the run, but the essence of the man remained unmistakable. Charles Kimsey, now 48 years old, was living under a new name, moving through the world with the same quick, nervous energy that had once unnerved his coworkers at the lake. He was apprehended without the grand spectacle one might expect for a triple murderer. There was no shootout, no desperate flight into the wilderness. Instead, there was the cold click of handcuffs and the realization that the long game of hide-and-seek had finally come to an end. When the news reached Bend, a wave of grim satisfaction rippled through the community, but it was quickly tempered by the realization that catching a man and convicting him are 2 very different burdens. As Kimsey was brought back to Oregon, the atmosphere in the interrogation room was heavy with the scent of stale tobacco and the weight of a decade of questions. He sat there, his lips drawn back in that characteristic, macabre smile, his voice a hurried chatter that seemed to hiss through his teeth. He was defiant. He claimed he had been miles away, working on the Moffat Tunnel in Colorado when the trappers met their end. He spoke with the confidence of a man who knew that time was his greatest ally. The fur dealer in Portland, who had purchased the stolen pelts in January of 1924, was called to look upon the suspect. But 10 years is an eternity for the human memory. The dealer looked at the graying man before him and hesitated. The certainty required for a death penalty case began to erode like a riverbank in a flood. The physical evidence was compelling, the timing, the motive of the stolen wallet, the proximity, but it was all circumstantial. The justice system, with its rigid requirements and its demand for absolute proof, began to grind to a frustrating halt. Sheriff Macaulay and the prosecutors faced an agonizing choice. They were certain Kimsey was their man, but they could not risk an acquittal that would let him walk free forever. They pivoted to a crime with a living witness, a ghost from Kimsey's past that had refused to stay buried. In 1923, a year before the Lava Lake murders, Kimsey had hired a stagecoach driver named Harrison to take him into the desert. He had slugged the man, bound his hands with baling wire, and cast him into the black depths of an abandoned well, leaving him to die. But Harrison had survived, clawing his way out of the earth with a prehistoric will to live. When Harrison stepped into the courtroom in 1933, his finger pointed directly at Kimsey with a terrifying clarity. The jury took only 3 hours to reach their verdict. Kimsey was sentenced to life imprisonment in the Oregon State Penitentiary. It was a victory, of sorts. The man who had likely slaughtered 3 friends for a sack of furs would spend the rest of his functional life behind bars. But as the cell door slammed shut, the files on the Lava Lake murders remained open. The labels marked Unsolved, a permanent scar on the history of the High Cascades. The years that followed only deepened the mystery. There were whispers of an accomplice, a man named Ray Jackson Van Buren, whose name would occasionally surface in the dark corners of other investigations. Van Buren was a man described as a glib talker, the kind of person who could lead 3 wary trappers out of their secure cabin and into an ambush. But the trail to Van Buren was even colder than the one that had led to Kimsey. In 1938, Van Buren took his own life, taking whatever secrets he held to the grave. Kimsey himself would eventually be paroled in 1957, an old man of 72, vanishing into the quiet obscurity of Idaho where he would live until the age of 90. He never confessed. He never gave the families of Edward Nichols, Roy Wilson, or Dewey Morris the closure they so desperately craved. The shadow of those 10 years of pursuit had ended not in a revelation, but in a long, slow fade into the fog of history, leaving the waters of Little Lava Lake to hold their secrets in a cold, silent embrace that lasts to this very day. The air in the Deschutes National Forest carries a weight that time cannot lighten. Even now, nearly 100 years after the snows of 1924 finally receded, the towering Douglas firs and the slender lodgepole pines seem to lean inward, as if whispering secrets to one another that they refuse to share with the world of the living. To walk through the shadows of the Cascades is to move through a landscape defined by silence and deep, biting cold. The scent of damp earth and decaying pine needles rises from the forest floor, a thick, fragrant carpet that muffles the sound of every footfall. There is a specific kind of stillness here, a stillness that feels heavy and deliberate, like a long-held breath. In the winter months, when the white drifts pile high against the gnarled trunks and the sky turns the color of tarnished pewter, you can almost hear the faint, phantom ring of a trapper's axe or the distant, rhythmic crunch of snowshoes against the crust of the ice. It is a place of breathtaking beauty, where the emerald waters of Little Lava Lake mirror the jagged, volcanic peaks of Mount Bachelor. Yet there is a lingering chill that has nothing to do with the temperature. It is the chill of a question that has never been answered, a truth that remains buried deep beneath the silt and the ancient lava flows of the high desert wilderness. The investigation into the deaths of Edward Nichols, Roy Wilson, and Dewey Morris eventually slowed to a crawl, mirroring the glacial pace of the winter itself. Lawmen like Sheriff Claude Macaulay and Sergeant Arthur Tuck spent years chasing ghosts through the rugged terrain of the Pacific Northwest. They looked for a man with a herky-jerky gait and a macabre, toothy smile, a man known as Charles Kimsey. Kimsey was a shadow that moved through the 1920s under a dozen different names, a figure who seemed to vanish and reappear like wood smoke in a gale. When he was finally apprehended in 1933 in the remote reaches of Kalispell, Montana, he didn't wait for the officers to mention the lake. He spoke of it first, denying his involvement before he was even accused. There was a desperate, nervous energy to him, a man who spoke rapidly through clenched teeth, his lips drawn back in a constant, unsettling grin. But the law is a creature of evidence, and though the circumstantial trail was thick with the scent of guilt, the fires of justice never truly caught. The fur dealer in Portland, who had purchased the stolen pelts for $110 using Nichols's own license, could not provide the positive identification needed to send a man to the gallows for a triple murder. Instead, Kimsey was sent to the Oregon State Penitentiary for a different crime, the attempted murder of a stagecoach driver he had once left for dead in a well. He disappeared into the gray walls of the prison, leaving the families of the three trappers to find peace in a resolution that felt incomplete, a victory that tasted of ash. Then there was the dark silhouette of an accomplice, a figure who many believe walked beside Kimsey through the snow that fateful January night. Historical whispers often point toward Ray Jackson Van Buren, a man some have called an angel of death. A schoolteacher by trade, Van Buren lived a life that was a strange tapestry of respectability and dark coincidence, appearing on the periphery of over a dozen unsolved homicides throughout the early 20th century. He was the kind of man who could speak with a silver tongue, the kind of man who could lure 3 seasoned woodsmen out of the safety of their heavy log fortress and into the freezing darkness. But Van Buren took his secrets to the grave in 1938, choosing to end his own life rather than face the light of a courtroom. With his death, the last real chance of a full confession evaporated into the thin mountain air. We are left to wonder about the mechanics of that terrible evening, how 2 men could overpower 3. Perhaps it was the glib talk of a familiar face, or perhaps it was the sheer, sudden violence of the hammer and the shotgun blast. The cabin itself provided the only testimony. When the search party arrived in April, they found a table set for a breakfast that was never eaten. Pots sat on the cold iron stove, the food within them long since turned to blackened crust. The most haunting discovery was a single, emaciated cat, alive against all odds, having survived for months in the hollow silence of that room. It was a witness that could not speak, a small, shivering heart in a house of stone-cold secrets. The physical remnants of the tragedy have long since been reclaimed by the forest. The cabin where the 3 men spent their final, hopeful weeks is gone, its timbers rotted back into the earth, covered by the relentless growth of moss and fern. The fox pens, once filled with the valuable silver-black animals that were the prize of the season, have collapsed into the brush. But the lake remains. Little Lava Lake is a shallow, volcanic bowl, its waters filtered by ancient stone and fed by the humble beginnings of the Deschutes River. In the height of summer, the water is a brilliant, clear emerald, so transparent that you can see the jagged rocks resting 20 feet below the surface. It is a place where families now come to paddle and fish for brook trout, where the sun sparkles off the ripples in a way that feels entirely innocent. Yet, for those who know the history, the lake is a silent tomb. It was beneath the thick, blue ice of that water that the bodies of Edward Nichols, Roy Wilson, and Dewey Morris were hidden, wrapped in heavy muslin and weighted down. When the thaw finally came in 1924, the lake gave up its dead, but it kept the story of their final moments locked tight within its depths. The watch belonging to Edward Nichols had stopped at precisely 9:10, a frozen moment in time that serves as the only marker of when the world went dark for him. That silver watch, its glass cracked and its gears rusted by the lake water, is a symbol of the entire case, a mechanism that refuses to move forward, forever stuck in the cold shadows of the past. As the sun sets behind the Three Sisters peaks today, casting long, violet shadows across the Deschutes National Forest, the mystery of the Lava Lake murders feels less like a crime and more like a part of the landscape itself. It is woven into the rustle of the wind and the hollow knock of a woodpecker against a standing snag. It is a reminder that the wilderness is not merely a place of recreation, but a vast, indifferent cathedral that can swallow the truth as easily as it swallows the light. The three men who went into the woods in the fall of 1923 were full of life and ambition, seeking a fortune in the fur trade and the quiet solitude of the mountains. They found instead a darkness that has outlasted their names. The questions of motive, of the exact identity of the killers, and of the final words spoken on that frozen shoreline will likely never be resolved by a judge or a jury. They belong now to the pines and the volcanic stone. The echoes of those shots and the heavy thud of the hammer have been muffled by a century of snowfall, turning into a low, mournful hum that vibrates through the air when the forest is at its most quiet. We look for closure in the records of the past, but some stories are meant to remain unfinished, their pages scattered by the mountain winds. The truth is not always found in a courtroom. Sometimes it lives only in the memory of the water and the enduring, watchful presence of the trees. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.